These words were never meant to reach us. They were cut, deleted, forgotten, or someone tried to forget them. This is not a theory, not a scientific hypothesis. This is a confession. And it didn't come from a lunatic. It came from Carl Sagan, the symbol of skepticism, the idol of scientific reason, a man who always stood on the side of logic. But near the very end, he began to say things that shattered everything he believed his whole life. In an unreleased audio recording found years later in the archives of PBS, Sagan speaks in a near whisper. "I think we were wrong. Consciousness is not a product of the brain. It's something else, something that uses us to observe." These words were never published. They didn't make it into memoirs. They weren't included in any official biography. And now, it's clear why. Because Carl Sagan, a man who spent decades fighting pseudoscience in his final weeks of life, began to doubt, not science itself, but its boundaries. A file titled Echoes 041996 Final was found in 2018 in the digital archive at Cornell University. It wasn't listed in the catalog. There were no equations, only words. And the opening lines weren't analysis, they were a confession. "I spent my life proving God doesn't exist. But the closer I come to the end, the more I feel. The question remains, and maybe it always did." Sagan wasn't just a scientist, he was an authority, a legend. And that's exactly what makes this confession dangerous, because it doesn't fit, not in academic models, not in religious doctrines. It exists in between, and that's what makes it so unsettling. In one letter to his daughter, written shortly before his death, Sagan wrote, "I haven't become a believer, but if you had felt what I've started to sense, you'd understand why those who return from the edge stay silent." He no longer wrote about astronomy. He wasn't analyzing galaxies anymore. He was writing about memory, which he felt doesn't disappear. He wrote that time is a mirror, and death is not a period, but a relocation. "I'm not afraid anymore, because maybe consciousness doesn't end. It returns." These phrases won't be printed in textbooks. They won't be heard on science podcasts. You won't find them on Wikipedia, because if we accept them, we'll have to accept that the entire model of reality might be incomplete. And maybe that's why Sagan ended his last piece of writing not with a conclusion, but a question. What if I was wrong? What if we all are? Just answers to a question no one dared to ask. In this video, you'll hear unreleased audio fragments, draft letters, and the voice of Carl Sagan, which may never have been meant for the public. And if you stay to the end, you might understand the most important question is not what lies out there in the cosmos, but what lives inside us. Spring 2018. A group of Cornell graduate students is working through the digital archive of materials related to Carl Sagan. It's a routine project, digitizing tapes, letters, drafts, for a future museum exhibition. One student, Jason, stumbles upon a file. The name is strange. Echoes _041996 final.wave format audio. Date, April 1996. Sagan died in December of that same year. The file wasn't listed in the catalog. It wasn't mentioned in any public interviews. It had never been quoted or referenced. And according to metadata, it was created late at night, at 3:47 a.m. in Sagan's own home. Jason hits play. First, the metallic hiss of old analog equipment. Then, silence. And suddenly, if you're hearing this, it means it survived after all. A voice. Carl Sagan's voice. That same calm tone millions remember from Cosmos, but this time, It sounds different, softer, slower, and filled with what Jason would later call a silent dread. In the first 10 minutes, Sagan doesn't speak of stars. He speaks of time, of memories that don't belong to him, of dreams in which he witnesses a life he never lived. He says, they all begin the same. I'm standing on a cliff above a black ocean. But it's not water, it's mind. I feel like someone else is watching through my eyes. He doesn't try to explain it. He just admits it. I always believed the soul was a myth. That consciousness was just a side effect of neural activity. But in these last few months, I feel like I myself am the side effect of something greater. The students reported the discovery to the archive's curator. 3 days later, the file vanished from the university server. Later, it was revealed, removed by request of a third party. Who exactly remains unknown, but a copy survived, and with it, another file, a PDF document. Its name, Final Notes. Inside, 17 typewritten pages, handwritten marginal notes, and on the first page, a single line scrawled in pen, "Do not publish." Unless I don't get to say it myself. It was an instruction, but he never got the chance. In these pages, Sagan describes episodes where he lost track of time. He writes about gaps where reality stops being linear. He writes, "It was morning, then it was night. Then I realized I was not alone, not in the room, but inside myself." He says that during one moment lying in bed after chemotherapy, he felt his sense of I leave the body. He didn't call it mysticism, he called it a breakdown in the observer's coordinate system. This wasn't poetry. It was an attempt to describe death as a relocation of perception. In a separate section, he references the experiments of Michael Persinger, a researcher who induced mystical states through microsignals to the brain. Sagan writes, "I mocked it in interviews, but I tried the device myself, and what I felt, I couldn't describe. Not fear, not hallucination, witnessing, as if someone was looking at me from the inside." That phrase appears 3 times in the document. From the inside, not the outside. He did not become a believer. He writes clearly, "No, I did not find God, but I can no longer say there is nothing at all." He explores the idea of an informational imprint, the theory that consciousness leaves a mark in the structure of space itself. If a photon leaves a trace on matter, why can't thought leave a trace in information? He frames it as a hypothesis, but ends with a personal note. If someone reads this, don't try to find answers, try not to look away. One of the final notes is a letter to his daughter. The handwriting shakes, as if written in weakness. "If I don't wake up, I want you to know everything I taught was true, but not the whole truth. Because there are things science fears, not because they are false, but because they cannot be verified." This admission shatters the image of Carl Sagan as a pure materialist. It reveals him as a man who searched until the very end. In the final minutes of the audio tape, his voice slows. He says almost nothing, but one phrase is clear. If you're hearing this, it means you feel it too. Pause. Click. Silence. This wasn't a confession. It was a warning. Sagan did not become a religious fanatic. He remained a scientist. But he reframed the question. And now, the question is ours. When you hear the name Carl Sagan, you think of the cosmos, of billions of galaxies, of scientific precision, of a man who despised superstition, who stood, it seemed, as the last barrier between science and mysticism. But just months before his death in December 1996, Sagan no longer sounded like the unwavering guardian of materialism. He sounded like a man who had lost confidence that reality could be explained by formulas alone. And that shift is revealed in his forbidden interview, a handwritten draft that later disappeared from the Cornell University archives. In it, he writes, "My logic is flawless, but perhaps reality isn't." That line appears at the top of the page, circled in pencil. Like a crack, the first in the scientific armor he wore all his life. Throughout his career, Sagan viewed the human being as a complex but ultimately explainable system. Neurons, chemistry, genetics, evolution. Consciousness, in his view, was a side effect of the brain, an illusion generated by electrical activity. But in one of his final letters to colleagues dated September 1996, he writes, "If consciousness is just a byproduct, then why are we capable of recognizing its illusory nature?" He raises this in the context of the so-called observer paradox, the idea that the very attempt to study consciousness distorts it, like a flashlight trying to illuminate itself. He admits, "Every time I try to localize consciousness, it slips away. Not because it's mystical, but because perhaps it's not an object, but a process, or even a field." In his final months, Sagan began corresponding with researchers he would have once dismissed outright. Psychologist Stanislav Grof, who studied altered states of consciousness, philosopher Thomas Metzinger, author of The Ego Tunnel, and most surprisingly, an astrophysicist working on quantum models of the soul, whose name is redacted in the interview draft. In one letter, he writes, "They call it unverified knowledge. I call it inconvenient intuition. What if consciousness doesn't end when the body does?" Among the archives that journalist James Lambert partially obtained in 2004, a slim notebook was found. Alongside formulas and diagrams were eerie lines, and uncharacteristic of Sagan. "I was conscious, but out of body. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't delirious. It wasn't a hallucination. It was. I saw myself from the corner of the room. I don't believe, but I can no longer deny." What Sagan experienced is unknown. It may have been a side effect of intensive chemotherapy, but he emphasizes, "If it was a hallucination, why did it feel more real than the rest of my life?" As death approached, Sagan increasingly wrote about his fear of being wrong. "For 40 years, I convinced millions there was nothing beyond matter. But if I was wrong, what then? I'm not afraid of hell. I'm afraid of shame. That I spent my life denying what our ancestors knew." He even revisited his public work. In a draft for Cosmos, he scribbled in the margins, "Remove episode with categorical denial of life after death. Leave the question open." It wasn't a rejection of science. It was a rejection of certainty that science had explained everything. Toward the end of his life, Sagan began using a word he once ridiculed, soul, at first in quotation marks, later without. If the soul isn't a substance but a structure of information, and if information doesn't disappear in the physical universe, then the soul isn't religion, it's a conservation law. He wrote that if human memory could survive brain death for even a second, then there must exist a carrier we don't yet understand. According to the memoirs of his wife, Anne Druyan, 10 days before his death, Sagan dictated a short audio message. The recording was lost, but she recalls it began like this: "If you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer here, but part of me is still observing." And it ended with, "Maybe we're not just dust. Maybe we're the witness to the dust itself." On the final pages of Carl Sagan's forbidden interview, handwritten, marked in the margins with lines crossed out and rewritten, a new term appears, underlined, highlighted, encircled in bold: observer field. Sagan no longer viewed consciousness as a mere byproduct of the brain. Now he saw it as a structure, something that could exist independently of matter, just as a gravitational field exists independently of whether it is observed. He wrote, "If light is a wave and gravity is a curvature in space, then what if consciousness is a field, one that arises in the presence of life, but does not vanish when life ends?" This hypothesis, he noted, didn't fit the standard model of physics, but it also wasn't refuted by it. It simply required a different lens. In one of his final notebooks, Sagan sketched out an equation. The variable wasn't E or M or even C squared. It was I. I equals what? This wasn't electrical current. This was the self. If the I is not an illusion of the brain, if the I can observe itself, then the I is not merely a subject. It's a function, a reflection of the universe upon itself. He questioned, why does observation alter quantum outcomes? Why does a particle behave like a wave when unobserved, more than collapse into form when watched? But who is the observer? Where is it? The brain, the eye, the instrument, or something outside of time? Sagan called it the split consciousness hypothesis. It proposed that consciousness had two phases: local, tied to the body, neurons, memory; non-local, part of an informational field beyond physical space. He wrote, "The body dies, the local I dissolves." But what if the observer doesn't vanish, but disconnects, like a transmitter severed from its receiver? This idea directly intersected with the theories of David Bohm and quantum holism, where the universe isn't a collection of objects but a single indivisible field of information. Sagan had always looked at the stars through the eyes of a scientist. But in the final chapters of his work, he wrote, "I think we were wrong. We assumed the light from distant galaxies was purely physical. But what if it's not just light? What if it's memory? The universe doesn't merely reflect, it remembers." He began using the term cosmic memory, and he speculated that consciousness, once freed from the body, might imprint itself into the very fabric of space-time, not disappear, but become part of the structure itself. One of the most intimate entries was a letter addressed to himself. "Carl, if you're reading this, you're still alive. But you already know the truth is near. You felt it the day you watched a dying star and, for some reason, wept. Not because it vanished, but because you knew. You once shone too, and you will shine again." He continued, "I no longer believe there's a sharp border between life and death. There is a boundary between form and its source, between the I and the observer." That's the question his biographers still debate. Most refuse to acknowledge any real shift in his worldview. But the facts remain. After September 1996, all of Sagan's public appearances were canceled. He gave no more interviews. He published no more scientific papers. He was working on what he called the dangerous zone of thinking. In a letter to Anne Druyan, he wrote, "I feel I'm standing at a border between scientific reason and something unspeakable. And if I cross it, I may not be able to come back." In the same notebook where he once wrote complex equations, he left a single page nearly blank. Just one trembling line. "You don't have to believe in the soul, you just have to remember it." What if Carl Sagan, the man who scoffed at mysticism, was also the man who in his final days touched something science couldn't measure? Not to destroy his career, not to convert to faith, but simply to stop hiding the question for the comfort of having an answer. When Carl Sagan died in December 1996, the world remembered him as the voice of science, the man who told us we're made of stardust. But his last work was never published, not because it was unfinished, but because it was too personal, and maybe too dangerous. 2 weeks before his death, he wrote, "I no longer seek evidence. I seek silence. Because only in silence can you hear that you don't disappear." He stopped writing formulas. He began writing mantras. Death is not a wall, it's a converter. I am not the mind. I am the one observing it. If consciousness is a field, then what dies is not the self, but its form. In a password-protected NASA archive folder, a file was found. Soulfieldfinal.x inside, a single text. No quotes, no references, just a confession. I rejected the soul all my life, but now I can't turn away from it, because it's looking at me. He described dreams where he floated above his body, not hallucinations, but sketches of the other side of awareness. At the end of the file, one strange line appeared. Observer not equal to identity, observer equals pattern. He no longer sought the I. He suspected it was a wave structure, existing outside of time. Sagan's final public words weren't in a speech, but on a philosophy forum. If we ever prove consciousness survives death, then we must rethink not only science, but the ethics of life itself. He warned, we cannot study consciousness as just a biochemical event, if it touches the fabric of reality. So he left us one question, not as a scientist, but as a human. Who are you when your name, your memories, and your beliefs are gone? And on the back of a handwritten page, he left one last sentence. I am the echo of a question that was never silenced. Maybe that's the true theory of everything, not a formula, not a proof, but a question that still lives in all of us. What if we don't disappear? What if we go home?